Indeed, there are, compared to Europe, a lot of prosecutions of very small cases. So they go after the minnows in all of this. And indeed, we could quote the Attorney General of the United States of America under Bush, who said that the people being prosecuted were the equivalent of, and I'm quoting here, white-collar street crime, which is to say, teeny tiny stuff. Absolutely no one who was elite and led the fraudulent lending operations that drove this crisis has even been seriously investigated. Therefore, none have been indicted, none have been prosecuted, and definitionally none have been convicted, and none have been sentenced. So no, this is a crime that, accounting control fraud, that produced the largest crisis in 75 years, produced the greatest wave of white-collar crime in world history, hyperinflated the largest bubble in U.S. history, I'm sorry, world history, and has been done with complete impunity at the elite ranks. What people need to understand about elite white-collar crime is that regular police have nothing to do with it. So in the United States context, we have roughly 1 million people in our criminal justice, working in our criminal justice system. Extraordinary number. And of those 1 million people, about 3,000 deal with white-collar crime. So tiny, tiny, tiny subset. If you had called up the Houston Police Department as a thought experiment in 2000 and said, you know, I think something funny is happening on Enron's books and records, I'd like you to look into it, they would have hung up the phone on you and treated you like a crazy person. The police don't deal with that. There are roughly 1,300 industries in the United States. So there's somewhere between 2 and 3 FBI agents per industry. So a couple of things are obvious. One, they're not going to be expert in individual industries. They can't possibly be as a group. And they can't be out patrolling a beat. You know, you have 2 FBI agents per industry. So they have to stay in their offices, and they only go when people tell them, look here, there's a fraud. And how do those people tell them that? Well, sometimes it comes from whistleblowers, but whistleblowers are episodic. They can't deal with an epidemic of fraud. And in particular, the accounting control frauds have found pretty effective ways to deal with whistleblowers. Who's the most famous whistleblower in this crisis? I study this stuff professionally, and pretty much nobody comes to mind, and I'm sure that's true of the regular population as well. That's a very bad sign, that whistleblowing was made almost completely ineffective. Why? Because you don't just have this big compensation for CEOs. They've spread it through the entire system. So you know, if you blow the whistle on a fraud, not only do you lose your bonus, all of your friends and peers lose their bonuses. And if you're a manager, all the people you're responsible for lose their bonus, which means they're all going to hate you if you blow the whistle. And so that has substantially deterred people in the modern era from whistleblowing. So whistleblowing could never work against an epidemic, and in particular has been weakened dramatically by modern compensation. Second thing, and by far the largest, is the regulators. So in the savings and loan crisis, just our regulatory agency made over 30,000 criminal referrals. So for obvious reasons, a bank or a savings and loan isn't going to make a criminal referral against its CEO. right? The CEO kind of makes sure that isn't going to happen. So this can only come from the regulators. It used to come in profusion because we made it a top agency priority to support the criminal justice system. We thought it was essential that the elite frauds not be allowed to get away with it with impunity. Go forward to this crisis. Same regulatory agency, the Office of Thrift Supervision, made 0 criminal referrals. It destroyed, removed the entire function of making criminal referrals. And indeed, I prompted these news stories by pushing reporters, please ask them how many criminal referrals they've made and when, and against what level of institution and what level of person. I can tell you the reporter, the tone he reported when he talked to the Office of Thrift Supervision was, why would we make criminal referrals? That's a job for the industry. So they've forgotten that the entire concept of fraud from the top, even though it's well documented that it drove the savings and loan crisis and that it drove the Enron era crisis and it drove the sort of non-crisis, as it turned out, in 1990, 1991 of liar's loans, right? Those all came from the top and such, and here they've given up. Well, maybe the Office of Thrift Supervision is just weird. The Office of Comptroller of the Currency, depending on which spokesperson, they've said 2 different things, has either made 0 or 3 criminal referrals. Well, the Germans have a phrase, einmal ist keinmal, once is never. Well, 3 is never against an epidemic of fraud. So even if they did 3, it's essentially they stopped making criminal referrals. The Federal Reserve made 3 referrals for discriminatory lending, 2 against teeny tiny places and a 3rd against a foreign entity. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was smart enough to refuse to answer the question. But we know the answer was embarrassingly small for them as well. So if you don't get criminal referrals against the elites driving the frauds, what do you do as an FBI agent? You take the criminal referrals you get from the industry. Is the industry going to rat out its own CEO? It's going to rat out Mary and Tom, little folks, the equivalent, as Attorney General Mukasey said, of white-collar street crime. And so that's what all the FBI agents have been looking at full-time. They have done no serious investigation of any major entity. To give you contrast, as late as fiscal year 2007, there were 120 FBI agents nationwide working on all cases of mortgage fraud. In the savings and loan crisis, there were 1,000 FBI agents assigned to working just that one industry. And this crisis caused losses that are at least 70 times larger than the savings and loan crisis. And we had 1/8 as many people. We're now up to a grand total of somewhere around 330 FBI agents, which is still 1/3 as many folks. And we are now approaching 8 years after the FBI warning of an epidemic of mortgage fraud that would produce a crisis. So the reaction has been timid, the resources are grotesquely inadequate, and they are completely misapplied to the minnows instead of the whales that produce the crisis. They have forgotten, or at least purport to forget, that frauds can come from CEOs. They don't even look anymore. And this is because finance is the leading source of political contributions to both U.S. parties in the United States, and because economics, which George Akerlof and Paul Romer, again, ended their paper because they wanted to emphasize this point. Now we know better, and we don't have to experience these crises again. ignored knowing better. So the standard economics ignores fraud, assumes it out of existence and such. And George Akerlof was made a Nobel laureate in 2001. So they're not only ignoring everything that we know is white-collar criminologists, everything we showed worked in the savings and loan industry, an effective regulation, everything we found in the National Commission to investigate the causes of the savings and loan crisis, right? So they ignore the regulators, they ignore the criminologists, and they ignore a Nobel Prize winning economist. Why? Because it's inconvenient to their ideology. It falsifies their dogma, and it falsifies everything in modern finance, which is dependent on the efficient market hypothesis, which has been falsified by all these frauds. So they could either give up their dogma or they could ignore. They chose to ignore and to keep their dogma. And as I said, political contributions now reinforce this dramatically. So Treasury Secretary Geithner, the New York Times has reported, Gretchen Morgenson, such, actively intervened to try to prevent even investigations of the largest banks, under the logic that the economy was fragile. Now, as a former financial regulator, I had never reached that level of Geithner-like sophistication to understand that we achieve financial stability by leaving frauds in charge of our most prestigious and largest financial institutions. The world has gone utterly insane. And I mean, more to the point, why is Geithner the Treasury Secretary of the United States? It tells you everything, right? He was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York at all points during the creation of this crisis. And he did absolutely nothing effective as a regulator. And when he was asked about his time as a regulator, he stopped the congressman and said, "I have to stop you right there. I have never been a regulator." Well, for once he was being honest, but you're not supposed to tell people that, right? And why would a president appoint someone who was a leading architect of the crisis? And after Greenspan left, after we got all these warnings from the FBI, well, then the industry added its own warning from its anti-fraud folks in 2006. Here's what they reported to the entire mortgage banking industry and all those brokers and all those folks as well. It said, first, these loans are an open invitation to fraudsters. That's a direct quotation. Second, the incidence of fraud is 90%. Third, these loans deserve the phrase used by the industry. They are liar's loans. Fourth, hey, we have experience with these loans back in the early 90s, and they caused hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. And fifth, the banking regulators are warning everybody who will listen, don't do these loans. Well, Greenspan and then Bernanke still refuse to use HOEPA to stop liar's loans.